April 18, 1942, 80 young American airmen are about to embark on their first combat mission. It might also be their last. The planes they are flying were never intended to launch from an aircraft carrier, but that's what they are about to do. They have enough fuel to reach their targets, military and industrial sites in Tokyo and 5 other Japanese cities, but not much farther. And even if they somehow make their way to China and relative safety, no one knows they're coming. Decades later, the children of those aviators visited China to quite literally walk in their father's footsteps. But is this mission remembered in China as heroic or misguided? What kind of reception will they receive at a time when America-China relations are bad, very bad? One historical event, 2 different stories. What really happened? The Pacific Ocean, vast and beautiful, seemingly endless. In 1941, millions of Americans hoped this vastness would protect them from a war that had been raging in Asia for more than 10 years. They were wrong. A year earlier, David Thatcher, a farm boy from Montana, decided his future was in the U.S. Army Air Corps.
When he was a young child, he saw an airplane flying overhead on that dryland farm. And from that point on, my dad was just hooked on the concept of flight, and he always wanted to fly. And so the Army Air Corps was just a logical extension of that.
Like many other children growing up in Depression-era Chicago, Charles Ozick was the son of immigrants. He joined the Army Air Corps for very practical reasons.
I think there are 2 intersecting reasons why he joined the Air Force. One was because he had just gone through the Depression. His family had 6 children. He was very determined to help his mother. So joining the Air Force would give him 3 square meals a day, and he could send money home to his mother. And I think also that people knew that the war was out there on the horizon, so he wanted to be prepared for that.
An unprepared America was going to war. 80 young airmen would be asked to change that narrative. The challenge is to see past old black and white images to discover the individuals who actually lived these stories. Who better to tell them than their children? Along with the children and grandchildren of the total strangers who rescued them. Ordinary people who didn't see themselves as heroes.
No, my father never would say, he would never call himself a hero. He thought that the Americans, the pilots who he helped, those were the heroes. He just thought of himself as just an ordinary person who did what any Chinese man would do in the same situation.
Starting in 1931, Japan began occupying an ever-growing portion of China. By mid-1941, 7 million Chinese had already died. China's leader was Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Chinese students rallied to urge him to fight against those who had invaded their homeland. One of them was named Tung Shun Lu.
There were student delegations that got together to try to meet with Chiang Kai-shek or members of the government to persuade him to prosecute the war more energetically. And apparently my father was the leader of one of these student delegations, and he met with Chiang Kai-shek and some of his aides at one point and presented a sword to them and tried to ask them to do more to fight the Japanese.
American President Franklin Roosevelt presided over nothing but defeat in the months following Pearl Harbor. Defeat and humiliation. Like at a bleak Pacific outpost, called Wake Island.
Cunningham speaking. I have a message for the President of the United States. In the face of superiority, we are obliged to give up Wake Island. Since our capture, we have been well treated, and I wish to thank the people of the Japanese nation for their consideration.
And Roosevelt knew that it was going to take much of 1942 to enlist and train new troops, to build more battleships, more bombers, more bullets, more rifles. And he knew that the initial nationalism that flared up in the wake of the attack on Pearl Harbor would be short-lived. And he needed to buy time. And that was really the genesis for why he pressured his senior military leaders to attack Tokyo.
America's commander-in-chief had given an order: bomb Tokyo. Tom Griffin, a navigator in the U.S. Army Air Forces, had already proven he was ready for even the toughest missions.
He was a boxer in college. He had a pretty good career until one day, I think he was returning to the university, had a terrible wreck and broke both ankles. He was still in college. And the first thinking was he wasn't going to walk again properly. And he said, well, to heck with that idea.
At the University of Arizona, a place where aspiring mining engineers studied, Hurt Machia was a member of the school's football team.
So he was there at the University of Arizona. It was a land-grant college, by the way, and therefore he took 2 years of ROTC, but he was famously or infamously the worst cadet known to man because, again, he was only interested in being a mining engineer. But one day in the spring of 1939, his fraternity brothers said that the Air Corps recruiters were on campus and they were giving people physicals for possible entry into the Air Corps as cadets. So this group of Kappa Sig fraternity brothers all go over and take the physical, and the only guy that passes is Herb Machia.
It would be impossible for Navy aircraft to bomb Tokyo. Getting close enough to Japan to launch them would result in the destruction of America's only aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Could longer-range Army land bombers be launched from a carrier? A 40-year-old aviation legend and newly recalled Army Reserve officer named James H. Jimmy Doolittle was put in charge of finding out.
But Doolittle was, he was more than just a pilot. I mean, he was an aeronautical visionary, if you will. He earned a master's and a doctorate from MIT. He also, during this early era of aviation, was one of the few pilots that was out there testing the bounds of what airplanes could do.
Doolittle, given the rank of lieutenant colonel, determined just one aircraft could fly this mission: a relatively new plane called the B-25 Mitchell bomber. There weren't many pilots who could fly a B-25. Bill Bauer could.
By June or July of 1941, they introduced the new B-25 airplane, and Dad, because he was an experienced pilot, and his squadron had the most experience in twin-engine airplanes, they got the B-25. So for the rest of that year, 1941, he was training in his B-25.
Eglin Field in northern Florida was miles away from anything and anyone. The perfect location to prepare young, all-volunteer air crews for a top-secret mission.
And Doolittle started planning the raid and realized he needed B-25s, and also realized the best trained crews were out there in Pendleton, out there in Washington. So he had them all sent to South Carolina, and he talked to them, told them it was very dangerous, they'd be out of the country, it was top secret, anyone could back out anytime they wanted to after they'd volunteered. They all stood up and said, let's go. And they went down to Fort Walton Beach and Eglin Field.
So in order to train them, they brought in a Navy fighter pilot who worked with them down at Eglin Air Force Base to try to teach these Army pilots how to be able to take off from the deck of an aircraft carrier. And it was pretty intensive training, as you can imagine. And not all of them were successful.
They spent like 4 weeks, better part of 4 weeks, training on how to do short field takeoffs and how to do celestial navigation over water, and also, most important, how to fly at treetop level for long periods of time at 160 miles an hour, which was probably stall speed for that airplane.
In late March 1942, the crews were ordered to the West Coast and along the way, told to fly as low as possible. This is how Doolittle hoped his pilots could avoid detection flying to, from, and over Japan.
So they spent the next few days hedge hopping across the U.S. And my dad had some pretty funny stories to tell. They were so low to the ground, sometimes they were buzzing automobiles and people were jumping out of their cars and like panic. But anyway, on April 1st, they finally got out to San Francisco and they flew under the Oakland Bridge.
America's newest aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet, would take the air crews within about 450 miles of Japan. The targets the raiders had been assigned included steel mills and factories, as well as military installations. Some were in Tokyo, others in the city of Kobe, Nagoya, Osaka, Yokohama, and Yokosuka. Even if the bombers could successfully launch off the Hornet, they couldn't land on it. Months earlier, the Chinese military had built landing fields in eastern China. The plan called for the American aircraft to arrive, be quickly refueled, then fly on to China's wartime capital in 1942, called Chongqing, in distant western China. But Chiang Kai-shek, China's leader, thought it was a terrible idea. He feared bloody retaliation by the Japanese military. On April 2nd, 1942, Hornet and her escorts began their journey. Joined by a second carrier group, what was now called Task Force 16 sailed west through the treacherous, stormy seas of the North Pacific. By this point, the flyers had an unofficial name. They were the Doolittle Raiders.
Dad always maintained that when the Navy guys allowed them into their poker games, they cleaned the Air Force guys out. And he said, we all took off flat broke. Not that we needed anything, but he said, I didn't win a dime. I was flat broke, and so was everybody else when we took off. So.
Along the way, this iconic scene was filmed. Jimmy Doolittle attaching several Japanese medals awarded years earlier to U.S. Navy personnel to a 500-pound bomb, returning them to Japan.
Now the problem was, on the morning of April 18th, the carriers were still about 1,000 miles away from Japan when they were intercepted by Japanese picket boats. These picket boats were an early warning system, a tripwire, if you will, that the Japanese had set up to alert them in case any Americans were sort of sneaking into their waters for an attack.
Task Force 16 spotted a patrol boat about the same time it spotted them. The small vessel was eventually sunk. Still, it was assumed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and Japan's Naval High Command had been warned.
Of course, the discovery of Doolittle and his men put the entire mission at risk. What were they to do at that point? By the time that morning at daybreak, about the time they were deciding to take off, they were still about 800 miles away from Tokyo. At 800 miles, there's no way that they would be able to take off, bomb Japan, and still be able to make it to China. Taking off at that point was essentially a suicide mission.
They're out in the mid-Pacific. It's stormy, it's raining, the swells in the ocean are about 10 to 15 feet, with some swells being as high as 30. They actually saw green water come over the flight deck as they were preparing to leave that morning.
They were launching about every 3 minutes. Very rough seas. The deck was pitching violently, but I think they had something like a combined headwind, both natural wind and the ship's speed. They had something like a 65-mile-an-hour headwind. So that's one of the main reasons that all the planes lifted off very successfully.
This is the last surviving film footage of the Doolittle Raiders. However, by using contemporary and period footage, along with still images, it is possible to visually approximate what the raiders and their rescuers experienced.
On the way to Tokyo, I had Gray, our pilot, make a few double drift maneuvers with the plane so as to enable us to determine the directions and velocity of the wind. We picked up radio stations on our radio compass. The compass needle indicated that we were on course, so you can give the Japanese radio stations an assist in guiding us in.
Finally, the gas was emptied from our spare tanks and everyone assembled for a smoke. Shortly, Sergeant Byther broke in with a land hoe, and sure enough, there it was. We all immediately got everything ready for business ahead, guns checked, interphone, final smoke, and a sandwich.
The raiders arrived at various places up and down Japan's east coast. Not surprising, given their relatively crude navigational equipment. The first American air crews wondered why there was no anti-aircraft fire. Where were the Japanese fighter aircraft? Admiral Yamamoto believed he could piece together a credible defense force. He was ready for the Americans to arrive on Sunday, April 19th. But they would arrive on Saturday, April 18th instead. The crews aboard the Japanese patrol boats, some later captured, didn't realize or didn't communicate that the Hornet was carrying longer-range land bombers. Doolittle could launch immediately, far from the Japanese coast. In Tokyo and elsewhere, it seemed like a typical Saturday.
It's important to remember, too, that Tokyo was, really one of the largest cities in the world. It's an incredibly dense city as well. So you have, arsenals right next to schools, right next to apartment complexes, right next to factories, and it's all just crowded in there. And when you're looking down on that at 250, 300 miles an hour, you just see a sea of rooftops. So coming in on your first combat mission over an incredibly dense city like that is a really tough thing for these inexperienced young airmen.
Their target was the Nippon Shipping Works factory, and they were able to locate that, and when they got over the target, they ascended the plane to about 1,400 or 1,500 feet, then subsequently dropped 4 bombs. 3 of them were 500-pound bombs, and the 4th one had 127 incendiary clusters on it, and as soon as that was released, the clusters just went out all over the place, and once they hit the ground, they started small fires throughout Tokyo.
Crew 14 saw a baseball game underway as they approached their first target, a military barracks in Nagoya.
My dad, in his immediate interview in Chongqing, said it was extremely hard to pick up the targets. The maps that they had been given were too small, too large a scale, I guess, and did not allow them to pinpoint targets very easily. But the first target was a barracks complex around Nagoya Castle, and Nagoya Castle was an ancient structure and was fairly visible. It was a high building. So they dropped their first bomb there on the barracks. They immediately came upon their second target, which was a petroleum storage warehouse. They hit that. They then had to adjust their course slightly to the left, and they hit their third target, which was the arsenal. And then they had to steer right again and go quite a distance back down to Nagoya Bay, and they hit the Mitsubishi aircraft factory. Just 1 bomb on each, and they hit all their targets.
The anti-aircraft fire the raiders encountered was ineffective. Any fighter aircraft were chased off. Not a single American aircraft was lost. 15 of the bomber crews were on their way south, then west to China. But Crew 8 was so low on fuel that their only chance of survival was to fly north against orders to the Soviet Union. Landing at a Soviet airbase, they would be interned for 13 months. The other crews were short on fuel too.
In a lot of ways, it's a miracle, and at least that's what a lot of the raiders said at the time. After they had bombed Japan and they were flying to China, most of them had no expectation that they were going to be able to make it all the way to the mainland. In fact, Jimmy Doolittle had told his crew that they were going to try to ditch somewhere alongside maybe a fishing boat or something like that.
Well, it's pitch dark. Not only that, but there's a storm that's blowing behind him. All the day he's been fighting a headwind that's been slowing him down and making him use fuel, and he has already gone to his crew and said, we're not going to make it.
And as they're droning across, as their fuel levels are depleting, suddenly they get this huge tailwind that comes out of nowhere and helps push them across that last bit of ocean. And the raiders would later call that the hand of heaven.
The B-25 had a reputation for being a rugged aircraft that got their crews home. But there are limits to everything. A beach on the coast of East China looked like a good place to land to Crew 7. They had named their aircraft the Ruptured Duck. They were about to discover that this duck couldn't float.
The engines suddenly seized up as they were almost to the beach, and they actually hit the waves about a quarter mile out from the beach on the ocean, and the impact of the landing stopped the plane immediately, flipped it upside down, and it caused the 4 other crew members, the pilot, the co-pilot, the navigator, and the bombardier, to be thrown out through the front of the plane.
4 of the 5 crew members were terribly injured. Gunner mechanic David Thatcher escaped relatively unscathed. The youngest and lowest-ranking crew member, he was now in charge.
Ted Lawson, the pilot, had a significant deep gash in his arm that went all the way down to the muscle. He had most of his teeth knocked out, but his worst injury was a slice to his left leg that went down to the bone. Dean Davenport, the co-pilot, had some wounds to his head, and Charles McClure, the navigator, dislocated both of his shoulders from the impact. Robert Clever, the bombardier, when he was thrown out through the nose of the plane, it almost tore his scalp off. Dad helped give the members of the crew some sustenance when they were traveling further inland, because he had a cup with him, and he would collect rainwater, and he would move around to each member of the crew, give them sips of water. Basically, he was kind of like their 24/7 nurse for those first few days, and he didn't get much sleep. He was just extremely compassionate, very concerned about the crew.
Other crews made it further inland. The plan was to radio the Chinese airfields, then follow navigational beacons. But the key equipment was never delivered, and the Chinese never told the raiders were on their way. There were no radio beacons, no mechanics, no spare parts, no fuel. Most raiders lacked any parachute training. Still, with no place to land, the only alternative was to bail out.
He popped his chute and literally hit the ground immediately. You know, here he is in China, it's raining, he has no idea where he's at, so he just rolls up in his chute and goes to sleep. It's raining, it's really nasty weather. He wakes up in the morning, he's in the fog, he can't see what he's doing. He gets up and decides he's going to survey the area. He goes over 10, 15 feet, and he's standing on the edge of a 300-foot cliff.
He was descending. He was in white clouds. As he described it, he said, I wasn't sure I was falling. I mean, in these white clouds, you don't have a sense of falling. Finally looks down, and he sees a black hole in the clouds, and the next thing he knows, that's the top of a mountain, and he hits and lands pretty violently, and he's rolling down the mountain. His parachute gets caught up in some little pine trees, so he stopped by that.
My father landed, his chute caught on the side of a mountain, and it was dark and rainy, and so my father just hung there through the night. It was probably around midnight, so he hung there for around 8 hours. And then when he woke up, he thought that he was up in heaven with St. Peter, because all he could see was fog down below him, and he was up in the mountains and didn't know where else he could be except with St. Peter. But then he recognized that he was caught on the cliff.
The raiders had arrived in a place where they didn't speak the language, without any food or equipment. They were being pursued by Japanese troops, but had no idea in what direction to go or how they would travel 1,000 miles to safety.
The raiders were incredibly dependent on the locals for help. It's important to remember most of these guys had never been outside of the country. A lot of them had never been outside their state. And so, here they were bailing out over rural China.
第一次看到身材高大的这个美国人，很多村民会吓一跳。我举个例子就是13号机组的领航员叫坎贝尔，他在鄱阳朗铺村的这个村口上的一个水井边，迎来了天亮。他水井边待了一个晚上。那么天亮的时候呢，有一个村民来挑水，走到村头一看到这个坎贝尔，吓得把那个水桶一扔大声的呼叫逃跑了，很害怕但是经过交流，他们知道是美国飞行员。
Teng Shenglu, now an engineering student at a well-known university, was visiting his future wife and her family in Japanese-occupied Shanghai. He needed to be smuggled through the Japanese lines so he could return to college in Western China. The people smugglers he hired had different plans for this English-speaking student.
They brought him to a place, and they pushed him to a room, and he saw a lot of people in there, including 5 Caucasian guys, completely muddy and dirty and scared and not understanding anything anybody was saying, and unshaven. And he was like, who are these people? And it turned out to be 5 American pilots who had just bombed Tokyo on April 18th, 1942, and had landed their plane nearby, and met up with some Chinese, but nobody could speak with each other because the Chinese couldn't speak English and the Americans definitely couldn't speak Chinese.
While some had written Chinese words in their notebooks, nothing could replace an actual interpreter.
Right away, he decided, not only am I going to help them translate at this moment, I think at that moment they were actually going to sit down and have a meal or something like that, but he said, China and America are allies in the war. We're all on the same side, so I should stay with these Americans and I should help them as much as I can.
Okay, so the morning of the 20th of April, they're in Guangfeng. The crew is together. They've had something to eat. They wake up. They're taken to by these soldiers and these 4 young men that appear in a number of pictures to a bus station, and there's a car there and there's a bus. They meet an official from the town of Shangrao, which is a much larger city about 30 or 40 miles away, and they're told they're going to be taken to Shangrao, which is the location of a large Chinese military headquarters.
飞行员他着陆的区域都是崇山峻岭、原始村这个森林，这个村民都是用人力崎岖的山林，把他们艰难的把他往下送到安全地带。你像这个4号机组的史蒂文斯，他一个人就在降落之后，他一个人在山上转不出来
就听的有的飞机一个高楼上保护的那个飞行员就来了黑的，来的来起的没的上来，拿来包给拿一个有大个给鱼，来就得一个嘞，50吨还那个车高楼上，这高楼上就跟某个很多西安馆，
某个海那里原来一个汉人有的从实地找什么，没实地方嘛，俺东福的，俺福的那那过一个1-2个方式，1-2个方式他少就1克吧，1克吃不是呢，他拿2招，一个那个子然后对个，按个来一个。搞得有点找到了的山东福建那地，那福建那地我宝宝的那2个女儿个也的，那我3个女儿个可找这好吃的， 那好这也要了，这海干没的俺个弄啊，算弄没这海了就进不。
Travel westward for the raiders was slow, deliberate, and dangerous.
Some of them had to ride in sedan chairs, you know, these bamboo things. Some of them, they rode trains, they rode boats, they you know, had all kinds of different kinds of transport. I think at one point they were in some kind of old truck.
Local elements of the Chinese military gathered the raiders together in a rural area outside the city of Chuzhou. An air raid shelter had been carved out of a nearby hillside. The raiders got to know it well.
Every day, the Chinese would come to their quarters and say, okay, there's going to be a Japanese air raid in 45 minutes. So go to the bomb shelter. We'll come over. There'll be 3 airplanes. They're going to drop 10 bombs. And when they finish, we'll come back out. He was amazed that the Chinese were getting that kind of intel from obviously other Chinese at the Japanese airfield, wherever it was, Shanghai or whatever, and knew exactly what was going to happen. So that went on, and they were there for a number of days to the end of April.
Not everyone escaped harm. 20-year-old Corporal Leland D. Factor was killed during his bailout attempt. Crew 6, in a plane they called the Green Hornet, was missing. Crew 16, aboard Bat Out of Hell, was missing too. Back in Washington, D.C., no one had any idea of what was going on. Japanese radio broadcasts were the first source of information. The USS Hornet, headed eastward, intercepted and logged the initial broadcast. Heard Tokyo English language broadcast. Enemy bombers appeared over Tokyo today shortly after noon for the first time in the current East Asia War. Heavy and telling damage was inflicted on schools and hospitals, and the populace shows much indignation. In the United States, the reaction was immediate. It was precisely the effect President Roosevelt anticipated. In rural China, the raiders knew none of this.
The Chinese were so kind to give my father the space and the comfort that he needed. Took care of him, washed his clothes, bandaged his wounds, fed him things he had never seen before, but he ate them. Because the Chinese treated the raiders so kindly, because the raiders wanted to give back to the Chinese, they would give them bullets or buttons off of their uniforms. My father gave that family a 1937 American penny as a souvenir.
Why did people in rural China feel they had a duty to help these strange foreigners?
中国有一句老话叫"有朋自远方来，不亦乐乎"。那么现在美国朋友从天而降，所以不惜任何代价，都要保护朋友的安全。但是每个普通的中国人是这么想的啊，不仅是政府官员啊，是中国军队啊，每个普通的中国老百姓，他是这么想的，同时也是这么做的。
The raiders eventually reached an airfield under Chinese control. From there, an American transport aircraft would carry them to Western China, to free China, to safety, and then home.
Of course, as you can imagine, Japan was furious. Not only had their homeland been bombed for the first time in 2,600 years, but the Americans had managed to escape to China. And Japan, of course, was at war with China at that point and occupied parts of China.
Death and destruction were at the core of the Imperial Japanese Army's retaliatory campaign in East China. Cities and towns were burned. Rape was used as a weapon.
They ultimately killed an estimated 250,000 Chinese men, women, and children. And some of them were killed in incredibly brutal ways. Their ears and noses were cut off. They were set on fire. They were drowned in wells.
The Japanese military also weaponized various pathogens, like plague and cholera, for use in biological warfare. As Japanese forces withdrew from parts of East China, they left behind food containing these deadly microbes, food which would undoubtedly tempt hungry Chinese civilians, food that would sicken and kill. The war wasn't over for the raiders who had eluded capture and survived their first combat mission. By the end of the war, 19 raiders had given their lives for their country. 19 of the 80 raiders in this iconic scene didn't come home. The Hornet didn't survive the war either. It was sunk 6 months after the Doolittle raid. But what of the missing crew of Plane 6, the Green Hornet, and the crew of Plane 16, Bat Out of Hell? 2 raiders, Staff Sergeant William Dieter and Sergeant Donald Fitzmaurice, drowned after crash landing in the Pacific Ocean. 8 men were captured and became prisoners of war. First Lieutenant William Farrow, First Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, and Corporal Harold A. Spatz were executed. The 5 remaining raiders suffered beatings, torture, and starvation. First Lieutenant Robert J. Mader died of malnutrition and preventable, treatable diseases. First Lieutenant Chase Nielsen, First Lieutenant Robert L. Height, and Corporal Jacob DeShazer were eventually liberated. Second Lieutenant George Barr, rescued at the same time, required months of subsequent medical care. Prosperous post-war America was literally a world away from World War II China. The children of the Doolittle Raiders didn't fully understand what their fathers had done to shape history. The same was true of the children of the Raiders' Chinese rescuers.
Dad never told me anything. He never said a word about what he did. And he never did. He never told stories or did anything like that. He actually had to sit in while he was talking to other people if you wanted to know anything.
My father had his army trunk up in the attic, and when he wasn't around, we would all take turns going through all this memorabilia, and we knew that he had done something important. And when I was in grade school, 1957 to 1964, he led us on the anniversary of the raid. He had a big green binder that I guess was given out at one of the reunions, and it had pictures of all the planes and everything about the raid. He would let us take that to school, and the nuns were very impressed about who we were related to.
He would give us little bits and pieces of the story, and I told you about the card games on the Hornet and how they lost their money, and some other little funny stories. You would be forgiven if you thought that it must have been just a lark, that Tom Griffin and the boys were just larking around the world from one funny little happenstance to the next. That's how he played it. That's how he talked about it.
I do distinctly remember that on Memorial Day, 1956, we went to Arlington Cemetery and we went to the graves of the raiders who had been killed as prisoners. And I distinctly remember the name Lieutenant Farrow and seeing his grave there in Arlington.
America remembered the Doolittle Raiders thanks to a Hollywood film, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, based on a book written by Tent Lawson, the pilot of the Ruptured Duck. The actual raiders gathered for annual reunions. Jimmy Doolittle, now a successful corporate executive, saw to it that his men knew that he still appreciated the sacrifices they had made. That included Tung Shung Lu.
So during this time, they were in Minneapolis, Minnesota, in the United States. And then one day my father opened up the newspaper, and there was an article in the paper, and it said, a group of men known as the Doolittle Raiders are having a reunion in the such and such hotel in Minneapolis. So he said, oh, hey, that's great. I'll go see them. I'll surprise them.
At times, the reunions could become a bit boisterous. Josephine Doolittle, Jimmy Doolittle's wife, had some thoughts about that.
In April of 1962, Joe Doolittle, who is married to Jimmy Doolittle, decides that she's had enough of just the good old boys in their reunions where they all just kind of sat around and traded stories. She wants all the wives to come to the celebration. But in order to do that, you have to bring the kids too.
It wasn't just the older generation of these male pilots getting together. Their wives got together, their wives became friendly with each other, the children grew up with each other, the children became friends with each other, and that was a very unusual, I would say a very unusual thing for these sort of World War II veteran groups.
And my dad's best friend at the time was a guy named Robert Height, who was one of the prisoners of the Japanese. And so I got to sit down with Bobby Height and listen to him tell of the 40 months he spent under the Japanese. And it brings you to tears every time you think or even hear it. And I got to hear it firsthand. And it was like, wow, this is great. This is what I was waiting for. This is the part of history I wanted to know.
The Doolittle raid was remembered very differently in China. The deaths of an estimated 250,000 civilians in East China were understandably hard to accept. 30,000 Chinese soldiers were killed or wounded. The United States funded, trained, transported, and supplied the army of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek long after World War II had ended. 1949 saw a new Chinese leader and a new China. Stories about heroic Americans certainly didn't fit the new narrative.
讲故事的以前的那个文化大革命呢，48呢都没有讲过这个故事，那个以后呢就没有讲了。那到后来我问他，这个是不是你这种事？我是说他讲过这个事。
Still, memories of the Doolittle raiders never disappeared completely in East China. For one family, those memories involved an American penny.
The interesting thing about that penny is it reconnected my father with that family, because in 2009, my dad got a letter from a family in China saying that they were trying to know what happened to this raider that they helped. Was he still alive? Did he remember? And they sent him pictures of the penny. They sent him pictures of the son, the oldest son, who now holds on to that penny. And they sent him pictures of the bamboo chairs that they carried him in and things like that.
At what became elaborate raider reunions, there were conversations about some of the raiders and their children going to China. In 2005, Tom Griffin traveled there with other American veterans and his son John.
The bus would go through towns and they would read what was going on, the big banner on the bus, and they would start applauding. So yeah, we were toast of the town wherever we went. They just really turned out in force and they couldn't get enough of those old guys. It was just tremendous, just tremendous.
Jeff Thatcher is president of a nonprofit group called Children of the Doolittle Raiders.
Actually, China was not on my radar, but in July of 2015, I received a letter from the Chinese ambassador to the United States inviting me and my father to come over to China for the 70th anniversary of the end of World War II celebration that they were planning in early September of that year.
David Thatcher, because of his poor health, couldn't travel to China. But thanks to Melinda Liu, who for many years was the Beijing bureau chief of Newsweek magazine, Jeff Thatcher was able to visit the beach where his father saved the lives of the other crew members of the ruptured duck.
Well, I'm out on the beach and standing there, and I suddenly had an epiphany. A wave of emotion just washed over me. I suddenly became aware of what my dad had to deal with, the plane crash landing, him being a stranger in a strange land, unable to communicate with these people. And it was a really touching moment for me.
He even met a woman who was using a piece of his father's aircraft as a cane.
2018年这个10月25号，为了纪念杜立特突袭行动，那么浙江省徐州市呢，他建了一个杜立特行动纪念馆，然后纪念馆正式建成，然后搞一个开馆仪式，他们邀请了美国的杜立特突袭者子女协会，他一共有25个成员，到了中国来，邀请他们过来参加这个开馆仪式。
In the years after World War II, the United States and Japan, once bitter enemies, became trusted allies. By 2018, relations between the United States and China were at an especially low ebb. International trade was a continuing irritant, just as it had been for years. But now, there were strategic issues as well. American and Chinese military units often stalk each other in disputed areas of the South China Sea. What kind of reception might a group of visiting Americans encounter in China? It turned out they were very welcome. Volunteer historians researching the story of the Doolittle Raiders in Jiangxi Province were anxious to meet them.
我们主要就是想，就是从上老营救的4号机、5号机、13号机、14号机，如果都有飞行员的子女来了，我们可以给他建立联系。所以我就主动的就是跟他们这个成员交流，最后我们找来找去，最后我找到了就是在上老广丰着陆的14号机的这个飞行员。
As I joined up with the CDR group, or the children's group at Chuzhou, a delegation from Shangrao came that I had not met when I was there, and that was Professor Lowe and his group, and I've maintained contact with him, and he's done tremendous research finding who these people were in the various pictures and family members, and we're still doing that. We're still in the process of trying to find more information.
Multiple museums and memorials dedicated to the Doolittle Raiders can be found in East China, including the restored medical clinic where the crew of the ruptured duck were treated.
I met the son of the man who had saved my father, the eldest son. Everything goes to the eldest son over in China. I met his brothers, his children.
Still, what impact did the Doolittle raid really have? The damage caused was minimal. There were unintentional civilian deaths as well. Yet it's undeniable that Japanese pilots and aircraft who might have battled US or Chinese forces were instead held back to defend Tokyo. The largest impact was on the June 1942 battle for a mid-Pacific island called Midway.
It's important to look, though, at the lead up to the Battle of Midway, because Admiral Yamamoto, who was the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor, really felt that the strike on Hawaii had not been successful because America's aircraft carriers weren't there that Sunday morning. And so he had pitched an idea to lure those aircraft carriers back into battle so that he could finish the job that his forces had failed to do on December 7th. And Midway was his idea. Midway at the time was a desolate, windswept coral atoll about 1,200 miles from Hawaii. But it functioned as an important submarine and air base for the Americans. It was essentially a priceless piece of Pacific real estate. And he knew that if he attacked Midway, America would have no choice but to bring those aircraft carriers back into battle, and he could crush them and do the job that he had meant to do at Pearl Harbor.
The American pilots who sank 4 Japanese aircraft carriers during the Battle of Midway fundamentally changed the Pacific War. Those pilots, like the Doolittle Raiders, didn't consider themselves heroes. The same is true for the unlikely group of Chinese men and women who rescued many of the raiders.
And some of the other Chinese were, literally fishermen, farmers, part bandits. They were totally not the people that you would expect to be able to get along with any kind of foreigner. Some of them didn't even know what nationality these white guys were. They thought, are they Japanese? And they'd never seen anybody like that before. And yet, despite all those challenges and all those cultural differences, they found a way to communicate, they found a way to move together, they found a way to escape, and they found a way to help each other.
The bonds forged by the children of the Doolittle Raiders had an unanticipated humanitarian impact in 2020.
In February of 2020, when the pandemic was raging in China, the children of the Doolittle Raiders were contacted by our friends in the Chuzhou municipal government, and they were desperate for personal protective equipment, PPE.
CDR sent surgical masks, goggles, and gowns, along with $6,000 to their friends in China.
And then in April of 2020, I received a letter from the Chuzhou municipal government. Prior to that, they had sent me a heartfelt letter of thanks, thanking the CDR for our efforts to get them their PPE. Well, they wrote me a letter back in April and said, hey, we understand the pandemic's raging in the U.S. We would like to reciprocate your earlier gesture of goodwill and provide you, the CDR, with PPE for whatever needs that you have. I contacted the state of Arkansas and said, hey, we're going to be receiving a fairly significant shipment of thousands of surgical masks from the Chuzhou municipal government. We'd like to know if there's a need for those here in Arkansas. Well, there obviously was. PPE was in short supply at the time.
Jimmy Doolittle was awarded America's highest military decoration, the Congressional Medal of Honor. All of the Raiders received a Distinguished Flying Cross. David Thatcher was awarded the Silver Star. Still, time would do what enemy anti-aircraft fire and fighter planes couldn't. It has taken the lives of all the Raiders and removed their story from public memory. Today, most Americans don't know who the Doolittle Raiders were, what they did, or why it was important.
When I left on that trip to China, I was sitting at O'Hare Airport and waiting to get on the plane and was talking to other people who were traveling to China too, asking them why they were going there. And they were going there just to tour and go around or go through China to someplace else. And I asked them if they knew about the Doolittle Tokyo Raid, and nobody knows anything about the Doolittle Tokyo Raid. And they were my age, which, you know, so when I explained them about the raid, I thought, well, I'm passing on history here.
Restoring that memory is the mission of the children and grandchildren of the Raiders. Professor Lu Shiping and his volunteers are working to preserve these memories too.
铭记历史，缅怀英雄。杜立特突袭行动的飞行员是传奇英雄，为营救美国飞行员而做出重大牺牲的中国浙江和江西人民也是英雄。突袭者的突袭行动是伟大的传奇故事，但他们在中国的经历更是突袭行动中最精彩的传奇篇章。我们要永远铭记这段历史，永远缅怀创造这段历史的伟大英雄。
The Doolittle Raid shaped not just history, but the Raiders, their rescuers, and their families as well.
Before that, he was a happy-go-lucky second lieutenant. You know, they were just having fun and being in the military, and they got to fly an airplane all the time, and they didn't really do anything. And then literally right off the bat, in the very, very first weeks of the war, he becomes a human. He becomes a brave, courageous human being. It shaped him. It made him who he was, because from that moment on, he was no longer a kid.
I get emotional because I don't think I realized how much drama there was when I actually was small, was a child. Had I realized it even 10 years earlier, I could have talked with my father a lot more about it. You know, it's sort of a bittersweet feeling to have all that history having happened to someone so close to me, but I didn't really take full advantage of it at the time.
The China which exists today is totally unlike the China the Doolittle Raiders experienced. Yet this new China can trace its roots back to events that occurred decades ago in the small towns and tiny villages of rural China.
So I wanted to go there to say a thank you from my family to those people. And when I left China in 2018, I announced that I came over with 4 nationalities, Polish, Czechoslovakian, French, and Irish, but I was going home with 5 because I added China to one of my nationalities.
It is probably safe to assume that the United States and the People's Republic of China will continue to disagree on virtually everything. But one thing the American people and the Chinese people agree on is the heroism of the Doolittle Raiders and the courage of their Chinese rescuers.
No matter how different the backgrounds, the cultures, the ethnic identities, the nationalities, the governments, that there's still ways for human beings to relate to each other and to help each other survive. I think that's the legacy.